All right, my friends, so far we've seen how to create a single context to store some data, and then we've used that data in the navbar and the to-do list components. We've also changed the theme of the navbar and the to-do list components with this context data. We did that using this provider right here and passing in this value. But what if we want some different kinds of data? For example, what if we had some authentication data for the currently logged in user, like email, name, something like that? Would we put that in the same context in here? Probably you're thinking it's not a good idea because this is for the theme and it doesn't make much sense to put some kind of authentication data inside this context. So what do? What we can do is just create multiple different contexts. So in this lesson, we're going to learn how to create multiple contexts. So if we have some kind of data and that is for one part of our application, we could create context for that. If we have some other kind of data, which is going to be global for another part of the application, we could just create another context for that. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so I'll create a new file and I'll call it auth context. So then inside of here, I'm going to import React. So I'm going to say import React from React. And again, we'll also need to import create context because that's the function that we'll need to create a context. And then down in here, I'll say export const, and I'll call this auth context and set it to equal to create context. All right, so we are following the same steps like we did in the theme context, just like we did in here. Okay, so now down in here, let's do a class component. So I'm going to say class, then I will call this as auth context provider extends react.component. And inside the component, we're going to use the state. So state is equal to just an empty object right now. And we're going to just add some properties to the state in a second. The state is just going to hold simple data, so I'm going to keep this really simple because I don't need to demonstrate how to use authentication, right? This is a series about using context, and this video is about using multiple contexts. So I'm just going to keep it as simple as possible just to show you how we can use multiple different contexts in our application. Okay, so let's say is logged in. And this is going to be a Boolean. And let's say false to begin with. And we're going to check to see if the user is logged in or not with this Boolean property. Then I'm going to create a render method. This will return some JSX. And lastly, let's export this. So I'm going to say export default auth context provider. Okay, so now I need to create a function so that we can toggle this is logged in property. So I'll say change auth status, all right, because that's what we're going to do inside this function, and set it equal to an arrow function. And then inside the arrow function, I'm going to say this dot set state. And the thing that we want to set is this property is logged in. So let's say is logged in, and we want to change it to the opposite of whatever it is now. So exclamation mark, then this dot state dot is logged in. So if it's false, it's going to turn it to true, and if it's true, it's going to turn it to false. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is return some JSX. And this is going to be very similar to the theme context over here. So let's say auth context over here, and we have the provider. And we will wrap all components that we want to use this context inside. And to do this, I'm going to say this.props.children in here. And we're going to nest components in here that we want to provide this state or function to. Then we have a value props that we pass into data or functions that we want to share. So let's say value and open up parentheses, and I'm just going to add data in an object again. So inside the object, I'm going to say this state and spread out all the values in state with spread syntax. And change auth status is going to be this dot change auth status, like so. All right, so now the next thing that we want to do is wrap this navbar and to-do list component with this auth context provider to grant them reach into this value props. So what we need to do is take this context and nest it inside of our app.js file so that it surrounds the components that we want to use this context in. Okay, so inside the app.js file, we're going to wrap these navbar and to-do list components with auth context provider, because these are indeed the components that want to use that data and that function. So first, I'm going to import auth context provider at the top. So I'll say import auth context provider from context/auth context, like so. So let's create auth context provider tag, and I'm going to say auth context provider. And we could nest the auth context provider inside the theme context provider like this, or we could put it outside of it like this. It really doesn't matter in this case because they're both still wrapping these components. So I'm going to put it outside. So let's close that tag off. Okay, so now we have both of these context providers wrapping these components, yeah? And these components should have access to both different contexts, yeah? Okay, so let's save all this and go to the browser. Okay, so let's inspect the page. And in the developer console, let's click the Components tab. All right, so now we can see both contexts in here, Theme Context Provider and Auth Context Provider. And if we click on Auth Context here, we can see the value as well as the is logged in being false. All right, so right now we can go ahead and start to consume that second context, the auth context, inside these components. All right, so that means that the next step is to figure out how to consume the multiple contexts in one component. Why is that? Because, for example, inside the navbar over here, we might just want to consume not only the theme context, but also the auth context. And, there are many more examples after that. I am going to show you how to do that, how to consume multiple contexts in one component, but after a short break. So we'll take a break here, and we'll come back to that in the next lesson.